With that, today we're going to talk about phytase stability, and then we're going to circle back around and follow up on some of the calcium and phosphorus research that's been done in the past. Some of you might have had your hopes up, but I promise next year we will talk about particle size and pellet quality. They're currently cranking out data as we speak, so I wanted to hold off this year and save it for next year. So with that being said, this was the first big project I had here at Kansas State, and Courtney Trulock was the student that took on the phytase stability study. We ran it on our 1-ton pellet mill at the OH Cruise feed mill. You really learn a lot about your physical condition when you have to get 6 tons of feed from the first floor to the 4th floor and you don't have an elevator that's working. So Courtney did a great job getting the group together for this study. It was a pelleting study. We had 2 different retention times, but what we're going to focus on today is our actual conditioning temperatures as well as source. We used a LD ratio of a 10.67, so a pretty thick dye compared to what you would see in the industry, and our pelleting temperatures were 180, 190, and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, another thing I want to point out is our production rate was 30% of the rated throughput. So we were doing about 600 pounds an hour, where our mill's actually, this pellet mill's rated for 2,000 pounds an hour, and we'll come back to that later. So starting off, when we do these pelleting stability studies, we measure our conditioning temperature, but then we also follow up and measure a hot pellet temperature. That way we can figure out, okay, what's the enzyme or the feed being, what's being applied to that within the conditioner, and then how much frictional heat are we getting across the die as we extrude that into a pellet. So you can see here our hot pellet temps were around 200 up to 210 for our temperatures increasing from 180 to 200. So when we were conditioning the feed at 180 degrees, our hot pellet temps, or the change in temperature across the die, was actually 20 degrees. That's really high. So most of the time in the field, if you're pelleting at 180, we would expect a hot pellet temp around 185. So there's the first sign that we did have a lot of frictional heat going across the die. We can attribute this, 1, to the thick die that we used, 2, we had less than 1% of fat in these diets, which, as we know, fat helps with the lubrication process. So once we collected our cool pellet samples and ran phytase stabilities across all of our sources, our stabilities ranged from 13 to 34% at 170 degrees conditioning with a hot pellet temp of 203, down to below 16% when we conditioned the diet to 200 degrees with a hot pellet temp of 211. Okay. So first experiment in the books didn't go as planned. So when you reach out to all of your industry partners who are seeing things in the field, nobody was seeing phytase stability results this low. And so the first thing our grad students have done a really great job of is problem solving, asking questions. What's going on? What are we doing differently? How can we change things? And so we started asking those questions, and I was talking with Dr. Stark, and he said, you know, a great colleague of mine said, the biggest advancements in the field of science are when something goes as it was not planned. So this was not planned. We started asking questions to try to learn what was really going on. So the first thing we came back to was, we know that our study, we ran it at 30% of our throughput. So Courtney wanted to rerun the study. She started gathering preliminary data where she tested what's the difference if we run at 50% of the production rate, so for this pellet mill 1,000 pounds an hour, or if we run at 100% of the production rate, so for this pellet mill 2,000 pounds an hour. The 2 things that we think are going on is, 1, how are you losing, or how are you denaturing this enzyme in the conditioner? How are you denaturing this enzyme across the die? And so starting out, she backed her temperatures down and actually ran 170, 180, and 190 at either 50 or 100% of the production rate. This was preliminary data. Still used the thick die so she can match it back to her first experiment, so the LD ratio was just over 10.5. So we still had hot pellet temps ranging from 192 to 209. Another thing we learned in this experiment we need to be collecting conditioned mash samples so we can figure out what are we denaturing in the conditioner and then what are we denaturing across the die. So when she ran this study, collected her conditioned mash samples, found at 170 degrees we got 100% enzyme recovery, and then decreased that down to 43 at 190 degrees. However, when we ran at 100% production rate, you can see we got 100% recovery up to 180 degrees, and then it started to decrease at 190. So essentially is what we've done with our production rate is shifted that curve up 10 degrees before we start losing enzyme activity. And what we can attribute this to in terms of the conditioner, or what our theory is, if you keep your retention time in the conditioner the same, but you change your production rate, you're changing the conditioned mash fill, or the fill of that conditioner, how much feeds in that conditioner, and that could be influencing the stability. Okay? One thing I want you to remember here, we have 100% recovery in our conditioned mash at 170. So I'm going to keep referring to that as an example. So then we move, remember we had the thick die on, we had high hot pellet temps. How much phytase were we denaturing across the die? You can see our stabilities were once again low, going from 40 to 6 at the 50% production rate, and then 92 down to 14 at 100% production rate. So remember in those conditioned mash samples, my 170 treatment was the same. I had 100% recovery. Now going across the die, similar hot pellet temps, I have a 40% recovery versus a 92% recovery when I'm running 100% production rate. So now we said, okay, what else is different between our mills and the mills that are being used in the field? What else can we attribute things to? So the moral of the story for this slide before we move on, whenever we're conducting research, we want to be running at 100% of production rate because we know a majority of time in the field, that's what people are running. They don't want to slow their mill down, trying to produce as much feed as possible. So we proposed this question of what's the difference between our mills, and everybody was going back and forth. What could it be? What can we attribute it to? And Dr. Stark came in my office and he said, wait till you see what Marut did. And so I don't know if any of you know Marut, but Marut's very, very smart, and all of a sudden I get this email with all these numbers. He had all these metrics that classified the pellet die on a 1 ton, a 5 ton, and a 60-ton pellet mill. He had counted the holes on those dies, and essentially what he had done was calculated the die work area and then translated that into the volume per die. So how much feed is moving through that die at once. And so we started to see the difference here between these mills. And the really big things here that influence, or what we're going to focus on, are you have your 3 different mill sizes, the thickness of your die, and then production rate, and then how does that translate to how long that feed is in the die. Okay? So what we found due to Marut's calculations, which really made sense from some of the results we were seeing, on our 1-ton mill, when you ran an LD ratio of an 8 or an LD ratio of a 12, the time that feed was spending in the die was 11 seconds or 16 seconds. As I increased my mill size, or the volume capacity that could go through that die at once, that die retention time decreased down to 3 to 4 seconds. Okay, so the actual time that feed is spending in the die is less on our larger mills than our smaller mills. The other thing from a research standpoint to keep in mind, this difference here is greater than this difference here. So that might be why some people in the field aren't seeing as great of a difference if they are using 2 different dies as what we're seeing here at K-State when we're using 2 different dies on our 1-ton machine. Okay? Think back to that data I showed you trying to explain the difference in Courtney's data when she was pelleting at the same conditions at 50 or 100% production rate at 170, and she had a 90 versus a 40% retention on phytase. Where Courtney was pelleting at a 100% production rate, her die retention time is estimated to be 16 seconds. When she was pelleting at a 50% production rate, we can kind of guess that it was double that, more like 30 seconds in the die, or a lot longer, meaning that there was a lot more time for that heat to penetrate that pellet, therefore denaturing the enzyme. So really, thanks to the work our grad students have done in collaboration between Marut and Courtney, we're really starting to piece some of this information together, and we're really excited to see what results they create over the next year in confirming some of these studies. So next we're going to move on to phytase stability in terms of storage. This was a study that Carini did. Really nice study where they stored phytase either in the pure form or in a VTM for 90 days. And what they saw is at 0 when you're around 100% or a little under, and then as you stored that for 90 days, you reduced that activity of that enzyme to roughly anywhere from around pretty much around 50%. So we saw a great reduction in that enzyme as you stored it for 90 days, but then wanted to determine, okay, how did that influence performance of the pig, and more so for this example, bone ash. So these phytase sources were stored at higher temperatures, 85 degrees F with a 75% relative humidity. There's a negative control and a positive control. So saw a nice response to pigs fed the positive control with an increase in bone ash versus those fed the negative control. But for the phytase that was stored for 90 days, either in the pure form or in a VTM, bone ash levels were decreased compared to that of the positive control. So if you're going to have to store your product from a long period of time in these higher temperatures, make sure when you're putting it in the diet, you're putting in enough of that enzyme to get the response that you expect. So lastly, we're going to kind of wrap things up today, just touching base on some of the calcium and phosphorus research that Arkin and Carini have done over the last year or two, and what those requirements are. So in this experiment, the digestible phosphorus was increased up to 170% of the NRC requirement. So we're referring everything back here to what's in the NRC 2012. This is for 13 to 28 pound pigs. The moral of the story for average daily gain is adding phytase at 2,000 FYTs improved average daily gain compared to that of our control without phytase. So phytase, we saw a nice response here. And in terms of the requirement for feed conversion or feed to gain, when we increased the phosphorus level in diets without phytase up to 140%, there was an improvement in feed conversion. And then also as we increased the phosphorus level up to 125, 140% with the diets with phytase added, we also see improvement in feed conversion. So what this is telling us is that our digestible phosphorus for 13 to 28 pound pigs, the requirement is greater than what we're currently is published within the NRC. Carini did a nice job here with this study testing the digestible phosphorus requirement of 25 to 50 pound pigs. These diets did have 1,000 FYTs of phytase in the diet, and a similar result when fed up to 130% of the NRC requirement led to optimal performance for the digestible phosphorus of these pigs. So once again, the recommendation of a 25 to 50 pound pig is going to be greater than what's currently recommended by the NRC. So lastly, we're going to talk on the calcium to phosphorus ratio. One thing I really want to point out, these diets were formulated to have adequate phosphorus. So we wanted to make sure that they had the right amount of phosphorus. If you're lower on your phosphorus level in your diet formulation, that can influence what your calcium to phosphorus requirement may be. But these diets were adequate in phosphorus. The other thing here on our x-axis, what we have reported is the analyzed calcium to phosphorus. So what was the actual analyzed values of the calcium and the phosphorus in the ratio there? So you can see here, it ranging from 1 to 1.5 of our calcium to phosphorus. Not a lot of difference in average daily gain, but on the quadratic response, it was actually optimized at 1.38. These diets were formulated without phytase as well. So these diets did not have phytase. From a hot carcass weight standpoint, with the calcium-phosphorus ratio, once again, analyzed calcium-phosphorus ratio, 1 to 1.25 had the greatest hot carcass weight. So when they reran this experiment, these are pigs 58 to 280 pounds, and it included phytase in the diet. You can see a quadratic response as well, with the greatest hot carcass weight above the 1.25 to the 1.5 to 1 ratio. But still, when you increase that ratio up to 2, just a 2-pound drop off there. So kind of what I learned in grad school with the analyzed calcium to phosphorus ratio around the 1.5 is what this data is demonstrating.